the Brazilian working group. Okay, recording progress. So again, thank you very much, GCAP, Action for Sustainable Development, Gestos, the Brazilian Working Group for the 2030 Agenda, and the Mesa de Vinculación, the Latin America and the Caribbean for the Sustainable Development Agenda. I have an honor to moderate today's session, first debate, actually, after a fantastic opening and a plenary opening earlier today. And without further ado, I'm like to put the issue that motivated this session is that, as we heard and we listened to very carefully during the plenary opening today, that despite the development of an amazingly dedicated, technically and politically specialized work in all areas related to human development, human rights, women's rights, peace, fairness, transparency, accountability, economic democracy, gender and racial equality, respect for regional populations in their territories, and last but not least, the environment itself. It seems that the powers that be, governments, multilateral institutions, banks, private sectors, do not listen to civil society's calls. We've been doing this, many people, for a long time, and we've been debating some of these issues for a long time. And I was discussing with Michael Sautejeau, the editor for the Global Assembly Declaration, about the amount of declarations that we already participated in writing and delivering in many places. But somehow our needs are not being heard. So, and many times, most of the blockages against the SDGs, which is a common denominator of a prospect for sustainable development and saving the human species and the animal species and vegetable, vegetation and the planet from collapse, which is the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda and the Climate Accord and the Financing for Development Action Agenda. So we have these common denominators, but even so, many of the blockages against these documents, these declarations, come from governments of the countries that signed them in the first place. And so sustainable development requires changes. And as we see, after pretty much 6 years after the signing of the 2030 Agenda, very few changes came about. And then a big change happened. And it was not a change made by political will, it was a change made by the circumstance and the contingencies of complete environmental and commercial and financial disarray. And that's the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a major wake-up call for humanity, as we put it. So I would like to invite our first speaker, and I'm very honored to call Ms. Mabel Bianco from FEIM organization in Argentina. I met Mabel a long time ago, and we were working first on the HIV pandemic as well. And Mabel now is a co-chair of the major group and other stakeholders facilitation mechanism within the UN. So in many ways, Mabel has a lot of inside information and has been dealing a lot with governments and institutional processes and procedures to say and to put the words and the voices of civil society in the right places. Let's put it this way. So I'll call Mabel, and I would like to ask Mabel to, as an introduction, a quick question that has been bugging me for a while, is that what will it take for the governments and the multilateral institutions to heed the call and take the commitment to change seriously, to really change? Thank you, Mabel.
Thank you, Claudio, and thank you to Gestos and to the organizers to give me this opportunity to reach you. And as you know, and as says Claudio, since last March, I'm co-chair of the coordination mechanism of the mayor groups and other stakeholders. We are 21, sorry, I want to grow up, 21 groups there, coalitions, so we represent a big number of civil society and other stakeholders. And one of the most important issues, last year we were participating, and we have voice at least, in the two big discussions that it was previous the high-level political forum. First was the discussion about the process and the changes in the high-level political forum, and later on the ministerial declaration. In both, and also during the high-level political forum, in our session, that is the session organized by the coordination mechanism and all governments and other actors, specifically from donors, from philanthropy, and from the UN, are invited to participate and to listen. We were saying always the same. We need a more ambitious, and this is the moment that politically the countries need to enter, to be strict and go ahead, introducing and addressing the systemic barriers that maintain the inequalities. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrate the inequalities. Now we all know, we know before, but seems to be some ones didn't realize. Now we know how are those differences and inequalities inside countries and among countries. And if we consider now the issue of the distribution of vaccines, this is completely clear. Developing countries, we are so less and less access to vaccines, while the rich countries are having twice or three times the number of vaccines, and they are retaining them, and they don't want to open the waiver, and they don't want to open the licenses in order that the vaccines are not going to be only a lucrative position, because vaccines always are to everybody without any discrimination. Now we are in such a position that we are in a devastating status, not only on health, but also the impact in socioeconomic. And this is the big problem. So all the barriers we have before, now they are increased. Are the countries or are the governments ready to address that? No. This is something that didn't happen. We were telling them, we were asking them, we were pushing them, but they didn't allow. And it was so terrible that in the ministerial declaration, it's really that there are some countries that are questioning basic issues as gender equality. This is something that couldn't be now understand after so many, not only the 6 years, but the previous 3-4 years that we were discussing about the SDG 5, and they are still questioning, and why they say if there are other places, why we need to approach gender equality. So this is something really terrible, but it's not the only. They were also questioning the issue of climate change. What about they don't want to accept that they need to change their ways to consumption. And this is not something that we could forgive, and we need to claim and we need to push to have them commit to that. But seems to be they are not. So this is a very difficult moment. And as you know, in the development also presentation or discussion in the financial development they have had also was the same claim, also was the same saying, you need to look at the difference. Please, please, let's look at those systemic barriers, but no one is paying attention, and seems to be that also the UN are allowing most of the countries and also giving a lot of importance to private sector. We understand private sector needs to be included, of course, but they couldn't be those marked or giving us where to go. They need to be to support what are the decisions adopted, and they couldn't give their own ideas and bring their ideas, because through the donor countries, and this is very important now with the private sector that is moving ahead all around the UN, they are guiding the principles. So multilateralism is now coming back to the issue that this is not the independence of the governments, is the saying, hello, we need the money, please give us, and they accept it. And now we are really so much committed to change that. So if it's any problem inside the UN, we couldn't accept to have this coming back to the private sector and giving the opportunity to guide the ideas. And yesterday, in the SDG moment, there were 3 persons talking from our communities. They have only 3 minutes each one, so few time as usual, but they say what they need. And one of them is Stefano Prato from the Development Funding Group, and he said in 3 minutes all those issues. And our other young people from Uganda and from Pakistan says about the impact of climate change in the life of the youth and all of us, and also in the life of women producers, small producers. So what more they need, what more they want, this is the problem. So we need to be very careful and very strong. We need to request that at national level, at regional level, and at global level. This is our fight, and this needs to be, because if not, we are losing an opportunity. The pandemic gives us an opportunity. We are losing it. It's a pity, and we couldn't accept that. I stop here, and I think I'm going to be able to answer and to respond to some of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mabel. Fantastic. And as we see, the lack of ambition in such an important moment is just shows that possibly humanity is going backwards. And that's a pity. And that's extremely dangerous. We're really treading on a very thin ice, as they say. Now I'm going to call Nicolas Sautejeau from Action for Sustainable Development. And Nicolas is going to give us a little bit of evidence on what I talked about, which is exactly the fact that the SDGs, the 2030 agenda, is not being implemented fast enough, and it might not even be able to, reduce the damage that is already created so far, with the accumulation of so much negative externality that's caused by the financial and commercial determinants of our politics and of our lives. So Nicolas, please, you have the floor.
Okay, muito obrigado, Claudio. Hola a todos. Hi, everyone. Greetings from Chile, South America. Yes, indeed, I will be presenting a little bit about the People Scorecard, which is an assessment tool that we've developed at Action for Sustainable Development from some years now. Quickly about the methodology, it's actually a perception-based tool that was collaboratively developed in 2018 in order to provide a framework for civil society's shared perception about the progress of the SDG implementation process at the national level. This year, we've worked with 31 countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Caribbean, and the Middle Eastern regions. And also we received 3 contributions from European countries, which are in Spain, Germany, and Norway. Basically, quickly is a qualitative assessment tool that we basically, the process is that national coalitions distribute a survey based on the template of the scorecard, which is divided by the 17 SDGs and include 10 key assessment areas for each SDG. And then the draft scorecard is validated through a virtual or in-person workshop. Of course, each country, each national coalition is free to adapt the process to its capacities and national contexts. So within the 17 SDGs, we have, as I said, 10 key assessment areas, which can be divided in 3 broad categories. One is the policy environment, which includes national action plans, strategies, and legal and policy framework areas. Also, institutional capacities, the other broad dimension, which includes institutional support, which means tries to measure the scope of the institutional capacities, meaning clear mandate and specific budget allocation for made available for each goal. Also implementation at national level, which try to measure the perception and policy implementation efforts on the ground, plus more quantitative based assessment of progress indicators at the national level and then at the local level. And also, there's also an area that tries to assess the level of monitoring, evaluation, and reporting frameworks made available for the agenda. And the third broad category is inclusiveness, which try to measure first public awareness and capacity building efforts, transparency and accountability mechanisms, inclusive partnerships, which try to measure the extent of and perceived quality of multi-stakeholder partnerships, and also citizen participation and civil society engagement, which try to measure the extent of formal and informal participation mechanisms. So this year we worked with 31 national partners in Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean, the MENA region, and Asia, and also the collaboration with 3 European countries, as you can see. This covers also, obviously a wide array of political regimes, of political cultures, of institutional capacities, of fiscal spaces, of civic spaces. So, which makes for very different contexts and very different starting baselines. But given that we provide a standardized assessment tool and process, we try to actually make it a process that from which the results can actually be a base for comparison between countries. For this specific presentation, we decided to actually based it on the countries that actually have provided a scorecard and a spotlight report at this point in time, which is in Africa is Madagascar, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Nigeria, in Latin America, Guatemala, Mexico, and Brazil. In Asia, Bhutan, Malaysia, and North Korea. In North Korea, we partner actually with a civil society coalition that actually works with North Korean defectors based in South Korea. And in Europe, Spain, and Norway. Well, the first series of results that I wanted to present to you is the Scg Average Scores within this set of 12 countries. Well, of course, sustainable development being a complex and multidimensional concept, and the SDG implementation being a complex and also multidimensional process, it's a bit simplistic maybe to present sole figures for each of the SDG and SDG average, but it does provide some kind of sense regarding the state of play and where things stands regarding SDG implementation in these 12 countries. So the aggregated perception for each of one of the SDGs, as you can see, they're all pretty much in and around 50%, with an average of 53% for the whole agenda. And actually, SDG 12 is the one that is the lowest scoring goal at 44%, which is a pretty constant result, not only for these 12 countries presented here, but also is a constant within the whole set of 31 countries, at least the one that have presented their scorecard at this point. And if we can talk of a set of SDGs that seem to be more on track to an extent, we could maybe talk about SDG 5 on gender equality at 59%, and also SDG 1 at 57%. But of course, there's still a pretty large gap to fill, as these results show. The other set of results I wanted to present to you quickly on a graphic support is the key area average, which is these 10 key indicators of sorts that we have for each one of the SDGs. Here we can see that actually it's a policy framework area that scored the highest at 63%, then institutional support at 58%, national plans at 55%, multi-stakeholder partnership at 55%, implementation at the national level, 52%, public awareness and civil society participation at 50%, monitoring at 48%, and implementation at the local level, 46%. And the lowest scoring area is transparency at 45%. And what are the, actually the, if we group these different key areas in broader categories or dimensions, we can see that actually the policy environment dimension, which gathers the policy framework area and the national planning area, is the one that's scored by far the highest at 61%. And then we have institutional capacity, which includes national, local implementation, and monitoring and institutional support at 51%. And then the inclusiveness dimension is the lowest scoring one, and that's the area that includes public awareness, multi-stakeholder partnerships, civil society participation, and transparency and accountability at 50%. So there's a pretty large gap between the written law and public policies and the actual implementation and capacity to implement. Regarding the key takeaways that we can draw from these results, well, first of all, we can say that although the policy environment elements score above average, like 61%, actually the overall key areas that measure SDG implementation progress, which are implementation at local and national level, only average 52%, which points to a significant gap between public policy and the way these are being carried through at the different levels. That said, there's still a pretty significant lag in the policy environment dimension itself in order for it to be really conducive to sustainable development. And we can see especially this in some countries like Guatemala, which scores at 32% in policy environment, and Mexico at 48%. And actually Norway is the country that scores the highest at that area at 75%. So there's a pretty significant lag there. Regarding the institutional capacity category, the institutional support area score is actually carried upwards by Norway, which scored at 82%, and Spain at 66%, which gets the aggregated total at 58%. But if we actually include only the countries from the global south, the scores stand at 55%. So there's still a large gap in terms of clear mandates and resources for government agencies, especially in countries like Madagascar, North Korea, of course, Mexico, Guatemala, Brazil. And in this category, of course, what shapes the perception in this area is the interaction between the government income, government spending, and macroeconomic variables, which is known as the fiscal space. Also the level of integration between policy areas, the level of institutional efficiency. And well, in that area, the significant prevalence of corruption is something that is very much prevalent and reported in most of the spotlight reports, particularly the ones coming from Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa. And also the other point that I wanted to make is that the SDG localization, which is the area implementation at the local level, is one of the lowest scoring areas at 46%, with Norway and Bhutan with 70 and 81% being actually the highest scoring countries, while Guatemala at 29% and Mexico and Madagascar at 41% of the lowest scoring countries. So there's a lag in SDG localization for sure. Yeah. So the other key takeaways quickly is that regarding the inclusiveness dimension of the SDG implementation process, you actually have to be made aware that that's the by far the lowest scoring of the different dimensions at 50%, which is an aggregated figure that includes a high scoring country like Norway, which stands at 76%. But without Norway, the figure actually stands at 48%, so below average. So the inclusiveness, the participatory dimension of the implementation process is clearly lagging. Which is also can be seen through the fact that the aggregated perception on civil society participation also stands at 50%, which clearly points to a deficit in participation and reduction of civic spaces, particularly, for example, in Guatemala, which the Spotlight report presents that it reports that institutional arrangement there are very, very selective participations, only civil society that is lenient to the government is allowed to actually participate. There are also a lot of violence regarding human rights defenders. And well, in Brazil, as you know, the current administration has been governed by a lot by presidential decrees, suspending several participation mechanisms and, well, broadly diminishing, greatly undermining the evidence-based policymaking efforts. So regarding the multi-stakeholder partnerships area, this one gets actually an above average score of 55%, which was somewhat of a surprise. And we have very interesting experiences in different countries. For example, the All-Party Parliamentarian Group on the SDGs in Malaysia, which gathers civil society, parliamentarians from different parties, and also private sector and academia working on localizing the SDGs in Malaysia. We also have different processes in order to include civil society inputs in the Norwegian and Zimbabwean VNRs. We have also an integrated platform for SDG monitoring being built in Madagascar, which actually includes UN country agencies and civil society and local
Nicolas?
authorities. Yes?
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but could you wrap?
Yeah, for sure. And local authorities, yeah. So in order to assess delivery at the local and national level. Also the Interagency Technical Committee in Kenya, which gathers a broad constituencies. But there's also, it coexists with this whole society effort coexists with a lot of restriction to civic space, especially the freedom of association. So it's a bit of a mixed picture there. Also in Zimbabwe, also a lot of sectoral partnership, etc., which foster an inclusive follow-up and review process at the national and local level. But this difference between the multi-stakeholder partnership score and the one from civil society participation does point to the fact that there's this partnership that haven't been able to actually overcome the asymmetries between partners and bring about meaningful participation. So altogether, the aggregated perception reflected by these figures is one of fragmented, partial, and procedural gains in terms of participation, which are mainly specific to the SDG and follow-up and review process. So we can say that 6 years into the process, SDG implementations hasn't really brought substantial changes in terms of inclusive governance and in embedding citizen participation into the political system more broadly. Actually, we can say that the SDG implementation process has had a very limited influence in regards to institutional evolution and transforming political cultures, which obviously have held back a lot the process in every country and at a global level. So just quickly, I wanted to point out that if you want to actually read the spotlight reports and have broader information about the processes, it's all available in the resources and toolkits page of the Action for Sustainable Development webpage. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you, Nicolas. It was interesting. It was deep, because there's a lot of information to dig through, but I'll just highlight two things. One is the 12 that got a very low score, which means commercial and financial determinants, production and consumption. And yes, the other one that got very so for Ketty Marcelo to open her microphone and her screen, if you may. And she's a representative of the native communities of the central jungle of Peru. And she's here representing the Mesa de Vinculación of Latin America and the Caribbean. And she will speak in a sense about, the fact that the indigenous population of the Americas have been battling the emergency and the apocalypse that now the whole planet is battling and going through for 500 years plus. So at the same time, it's the population that is extremely relevant to save us on going forward. So please, Ketty, what are your concerns and how can indigenous population give governments of the world more light? Thank you. Ketty? She was here a little moment ago. Oh, here we go. Ketty. Ketty, can you hear me? Hola, Ketty. Puede abrir tu...
Está dizendo que está bloqueada pelo...
Oh, então GCAP. Can you open the microphone for Ketty Marcelo, please? The GCAP Global.
Sí, bueno.
Ya está.
Bueno, gracias. Por alguna razón me habían bloqueado. Bueno, agradecer el evento, la invitación. Siempre es bueno que se escuchen las voces de nosotras, las mujeres indígenas, quienes somos las que sufrimos los impactos del cambio climático y qué es lo que pensamos también sobre eso y cómo venimos a lo largo de los años resistiendo frente a estos impactos ocasionados por el ser humano y que también veo diversas reuniones, tratados, las cumbres climáticas. Sin embargo, estos tratados, estos compromisos no es pues llegan directamente a las comunidades. Nosotros no nos vemos beneficiados o no vemos que eso se trasladen a políticas públicas de los países, ¿no? Entonces, nosotras, pues, quienes diariamente sufrimos estos impactos, nuestras cosechas se pierden, las heladas, las sequías, las plagas que afectan directamente nuestra economía, ¿no? A esto hay que sumarle también la crisis sanitaria, política y económica que atraviesan nuestros países. En la ciudad es diferente el impacto del cambio climático frente a las personas que venimos del campo. Si en la ciudad, pues, usted sale con su saco y hace calor y se saca nada más, pero no ha perjudicado su economía. En cambio, en nuestras comunidades, la economía se pierde cuando las cosechas se pierden, cuando cae la helada, cuando viene la creciente. Entonces, es diferente. Se trata, para nosotros los impactos del cambio climático, trata de nuestros derechos humanos, de nuestra supervivencia como pueblos originarios, ¿no? Lo que también quería compartir es la pandemia nos ha demostrado, nos demuestra que la madre naturaleza nos está hablando, nos está advirtiendo que ella ya no soporta más el uso indiscriminado de los bienes de la naturaleza. El capitalismo, el antropocentrismo nos está matando día a día. La pandemia también nos ha demostrado que la madre naturaleza se recupera, vuelve a vivir sin la intervención del hombre. Nosotros, las mujeres indígenas originarias, también hemos demostrado que hemos enfrentado a la muerte gracias a nuestros saberes ancestrales, que es una forma de resistencia como pueblos indígenas. La colonización no ha podido acabar con nuestros conocimientos ancestrales. Si nos adaptamos también y si resistimos a los impactos del cambio climático, también es una forma de resistencia para nosotros los pueblos originarios. Sin embargo, al parecer no hemos aprendido nada, porque apenas se reactivó la economía, nuevamente empezamos a destruir con más fuerza la madre naturaleza. Las políticas extractivistas de los países avanzan día a día. Ellos nunca entraron en cuarentena. En plena pandemia, acá en mi país se propuso realizar la consulta previa virtual para seguir explotando los recursos. Ante esto se presentan grandes desafíos para los países, para los gobernantes, ¿no? ¿Cómo se deben construir políticas económicas de los países, ¿no? Nosotros vemos que estos están pensados, pues, en la destrucción de la madre tierra. El gran desafío que vemos es el cambio de paradigma. ¿Cómo construimos una economía sin destruir a la madre tierra? Aquí el cambio de paradigma frente a quienes consideramos a la naturaleza como un ser vivo, pues que no debe ser destruido. Esos pensamientos, ¿no? Desde los pueblos indígenas a quienes consideramos a la madre naturaleza como un ser vivo, y desde el mundo occidental, cómo entender la vida en armonía y equilibrio con la madre naturaleza. Ese es un gran reto que tenemos, el ser humano o los gobernantes, ¿no? Los grandes capitalistas, los países que no cumplen su compromiso climático. Vemos con mucha tristeza cómo los países, los bosques se están incendiando, cómo las heladas están cayendo. Sin embargo, ni aún eso nos ha hecho reflexionar, ¿no? ¿Cómo construimos políticas? Otro gran desafío para los estados es considerando los saberes ancestrales, la soberanía alimentaria y garantizando los territorios de los pueblos originarios, con el rol central de la mujer, ¿no? Tenemos esos desafíos y también considerar a la madre naturaleza como sujeta de derecho. En algunos países como Bolivia y Ecuador ya han considerado en su constitución política. Sin embargo, sigue habiendo mayor extractivismo, siguen destruyendo a la madre tierra, que tampoco no quede en el discurso estas políticas. Los países que que han firmado y ratificado el Acuerdo de París, las ODS. ¿Será cierto que al 2030 va a haber hambre cero? Terminaremos con la pobreza. Entonces, desde los pueblos originarios nosotros exhortamos a que los países también cumplan con sus compromisos, pero ahí el gran reto del cambio de paradigma. No solamente debe ser un discurso, una retórica, estos compromisos frente a la protección de la madre naturaleza, sino también transformarla en políticas públicas en los países. Y la sociedad también tiene un rol, ¿no? Sensibilizarse más. Yo siempre digo, las frutas y verduras pues no nacen en los mercados, ni el agua sale del caño, sino también, ¿no? Sale de las frutas, todo lo que llega a nuestra mesa diariamente son trabajadas por manos de mujeres indígenas, trabajadas desde el campo, ese campo que ese bosque que día a día se destruye, o esas fuentes de agua, esas cabeceras que también se están secando por la depredación. Si queremos cambiar el mundo, si queremos seguir cuidando esta casa grande, si no queremos destruir más, también debemos empezar a cambiar desde nuestros propios hábitos. No solamente los indígenas vamos a cuidar, proteger el planeta, sino también desde la ciudad, quienes son los que más contaminan. Entonces debemos de empezar a cambiar nosotros mismos. La lucha por la defensa de la madre naturaleza es la lucha por la vida de nuestras generaciones. Nosotros queremos dejar oxígeno para respirar y agua para beber para nuestros hijos, nuestros nietos, más allá del fierro y cemento que está metido en el pensamiento occidental de quienes destruyen la madre naturaleza. Durante 26 años se viene realizando las cumbres climáticas, COPs y otros compromisos internacionales en donde cada vez más los pueblos indígenas exigimos también participación, que nuestras voces sean escuchadas, de donde salieron grandes acuerdos, ¿no? Como el Acuerdo de París, las salvaguardas de Cancún. Sin embargo, el planeta se calienta cada día más. Los incendios no cesan en el mundo entero. Hay algunos presidentes de países, ¿no? Como Brasil, que no creen en el cambio climático, o los grandes países industrializados que contaminan más. Con estas acciones no llegamos a la meta planificada también en el 2030 de reducir las emisiones de carbono. Nosotros desde nuestros pueblos exigimos a los estados y a la sociedad en general también a ponerse de pie y a cumplir con estos compromisos globales, a tomar conciencia de cuidar nuestra casa grande, nuestra madre tierra, Pachamama, madre naturaleza, como lo llama, porque esto será, este oxígeno de nuestros bosques y el agua también, el agua dulce, los ojos de agua, será lo único que vamos a heredar, porque eso es vida. Como dicen por ahí, ¿no? En 50 años la lucha no será por el dinero, sino será por el agua. Entonces, también invitamos desde nuestros pueblos pues, a seguir luchando frente a esta destrucción de la madre naturaleza, ¿no? A seguir haciendo frente con políticas, ¿no? De conservación. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Ketty Marcelo, for bringing us back to reality. So we come out from, you know, the perception and the statistics of the SDGs and all the declarations. And as you showed yourself, there are so many declarations, so many resolutions, and they do not reach the people on the ground, the community. So our next speaker and for this session is Alessandra Nilo. She is an activist, an HIV and AIDS activist, women's rights activist that have been going through this process with multilateral institutions and advocacy with governments and partnership with civil society for quite a while. And Alessandra, please, what is different and what is the same regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate emergency that is present right now with the other challenges that you had before? Mike's yours.
Many thanks, Claudio, and saludos to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today just to speak a little bit about some of our challenges. I think that as an AIDS activist, what we really learn is that we need to put people at the center of solutions. And that when meetings in offices didn't work, we needed to occupy the streets, we needed to occupy the hospitals, we needed to push scientists and the press. So what we did is that we united our voices and protests with all strengths we had. So for me today, it is time for us to speak out very loud and clear that governments are not fulfilling their commitments, are not fulfilling their responsibilities. And actually, COVID-19 clearly not only exposed the inequalities, as we all know, of the world, but showed how far we are from the ideal of civilization that we built, and how, as you already said, Claudio, inhuman we still are. And this is very sad. So as Mabel was mentioning, the vaccine apartheid has shown the world that international systems are really hostage and captured by the greed of corporations, and that governments are on their needs. It is a fact. So no matter how many people can live or die because of this is what we are facing. So this situation, in fact, is an example, of course, of many other situations to those we need to say no much more forcefully. But moreover, at this stage, I believe this vaccine apartheid, it's like a cannon shot straight into the heart of multilateralism. We all know that. So let's not pretend we don't know it. And let's also acknowledge that perhaps there is no more time to just keep using soft words to express the extremely hard reality we have before us. I, in fact, at this stage, and after following and participating in so many meetings and sessions, etc., I really doubt whether multilateralism as it is will recover after failing in face of one of the biggest challenges we imagine globally. The evidence that Nicolas was showing before, and the evidences that we know about greater poverty and despair, especially in the southern countries, indicates that in addition to climate crisis, in addition to health emergency and economic crisis, what we are facing now is an absolutely moral and political crisis. And to me, this is the main point for this People's Assembly. It's not about language. It's not about, how to deal with the government. We need to say out, this is a moral and a political crisis. And however, despite all challenges, still, the only way to overcome the situation is respecting the rights and demanding our governments to take back the driver's seat of sustainable development. Something that we have been saying since 1999. We are saying the same. Of course, we know as an AIDS and women's rights activists, I know it has not been easy to advance human rights. We all know that, especially in the last 5 years. And I know that this fight we face today is a historic fight as well. So from rich people against poor people, our struggle remains to be being once again against privileges, against the wrong decisions of those in power. We have seen this happening for centuries, but one lesson I think to remember is that we managed to change, not in an easy way. It was very hard. And usually that change is happening not just using words. Achieving structural change many times required sweat, blood, and even our lives. So now, however, I think the difference is that there are rights recognized in social, environmental, and economic rights, and we cannot let them back down. The difference today is that, and from today to the historical past, is that we know now, based on evidence, what must be done. But the hard part is really convincing member states to make the right decisions. So for me, it is time really to strengthen the link between our global and local actions. And it is imperative to strengthen the advancements of the rights in the territories, because otherwise we will continue to elect horrible leaders, such as Trump, such as Jair Bolsonaro from Brazil, who is ashamed, who walks without having taken vaccines in the streets of New York, that just gave a speech full of lies in the General Assembly. Or even leaders like Daniel Ortega that just today, kidnapped our colleague Ivan Hilario Sanchez, who is director of INGES in Nicaragua. So I believe in a multilateralism that will never accept this. I believe in a multilateralism that is not racing to the lowest common denominator, but rather one that is fostering global solidarity and constant learning. We need a multilateralism that can focus on systemic barriers, as Mabel was saying in the beginning of the sessions, that abandon silo approach to rights and emphasize system-wide policy coherence and much more coordination amongst all UN human rights and development systems and bodies at the regional and national levels. I also believe in multilateralism that meaningfully engage civil society and that formally recognize, and this is a very concrete call for the People's Assembly, formally recognize our independent civil society reports in those intergovernmental processes, including the high-level political forum and VNRs, because they are full of evidence, as Nicolas just presented. And finally, I think we need to have really something that we have been demanding for a long time, which is the appointment of a special envoy for civil society, so it could help us to navigate and to take our voice forward. So to conclude, I think that we are really witnessing an ugly chapter of history. So I have two final messages, and one is for governments and the United Nations system, which is, it is time to learn from the past and from the present and deliver on your promise and your purpose. And that's why you exist. And the other message is for our colleagues from civil society, because I think we should stop asking governments about their political will. It's not about their political will. It is about their responsibility. We must say clearly that it is their responsibility, their obligation to deliver our rights, and that we are not asking them a favor. So let's keep reminding them that human rights and not trade should be the basis and priority of a truly multilateralism. And meanwhile, I will leave you with the words of our beloved Bob Marley, who always remembered us about, we need to get up, we need to stand up, and we will never give up the fight. So thank you very much, Claudio, and I wish you all a great People's Assembly.
Thank you, Alessandra. Fantastic and inspiring. It's always good to get a booster shot for activism, because that's what we need. And as all of you four speakers put it very well, we need more responsibility, because we face a huge ethical failure that was exposed by the COVID-19 and the vaccine apartheid. And here we finish this part of the session, but your last words perfectly segues to the next session, which is right here. And I'm going to call Becky Malay to be the moderator for the next session. And it's exactly that, about our common agenda that the Secretary General of the United Nations has launched today. And here's the question: has the United Nations learned from the past, and is it ready to deliver on its purpose? That's what's going to be debated now. Becky, take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudio. I'd like to greet everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It is quite late in my neck of the woods. It's nearly midnight, but we are working so hard because our agenda is here. So I hope that what the Secretary General is saying in his latest report, our common agenda, would be something that should inspire everybody to pursue, because we are the people. We are the peoples of the United Nations that have put up this institution. So for everyone, I would like to invite our colleague at the Coalition for the UN We Want in order to present what is included in the common agenda that the Secretary General just came out with. So may I invite Nudara to make the presentation just for everybody's information.
Hi, sorry, I was just wondering if I could be made co-host. Oh, perfect. Okay.
Yeah, you are now.
Thank you so much, Becky. I'm just going to quickly share screen so that we can get started. Perfect. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Becky. And thank you all for the opportunity to discuss this thematic session. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. In this quick 15-minute summary, I'll attempt to cover the main themes and outcomes of the Our Common Agenda report released by the Secretary General on September 10th as an action-based follow-up to the commitments and challenges identified in the UN 75 political declaration. Given that we'd like to spend the majority of this session in discussions, I'll specifically focus in on areas that we as civil society might find particularly interesting or indeed problematic. So a quick overview. The central idea behind this report is that it's now or never. It's breakdown or breakthrough. This report is an attempt at a more inclusive UN through both process, through the We the People's consultations that followed the UN 75 global consultative process, and outcome with the attempt to redefine multilateralism through more networked, inclusive, and effective definitions. How effective this attempt is and through what avenues we might leverage these channels of inclusion is exactly what we hope to break open in this discussion. Across the report, 6 areas of action stand out: global solidarity, renewed social contracts, addressing the infodemic plague, alternative measurements of prosperity than GDP, long-term agendas and impacts, and networked and inclusive multilateralism. We've grouped these in general under 4 key pillars that we can base our discussions around today. So I'll go ahead and discuss each of these in turn. So first, renewed social contract. This discusses both a global code of conduct that promotes integrity and public information, looking at the infodemic, looking at financial structures and addressing issues such as tax evasion, talking about the rights of women and girls through equal rights, mechanisms to promote gender parity such as quotas, and investment in the care economy. But I also, additionally, it also discusses the World Social Summit, which is an outcome of an update on the 1995 Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development, and would ideally be such an outcome, of which the timeline I'll discuss very shortly. It'll follow from the Future Summit, which is another interesting case altogether. But specifically, I want to pick up on this idea of correcting blind spots in how we measure progress and prosperity. This helps address the first potential point of concern with the OCA. In addressing just the measures of GDP, of prosperity through GDP, we fail to truly consider the policy environments and incentive structures that cause the popularity of GDP as a measurement in the first place, when complementary indices such as the Human Development Index, Genuine Progress Indicators, or Multidimensional Poverty Index already exist. This is all the more problematic given that the Human Development Report identifies incentives as one of the 3 key pillars in furthering human development, which is one of the kind of central outcomes of the OCA. In other words, does the attempt at neutrality of language of our common agenda prevent it from problematizing the root causes of issues? Are we asking different questions because we're too afraid to answer the ones standing right in front of us? And how does this in turn affect the utility of the report? The second key pillar that the agenda focuses on is a focus on the future. This, to me and to many other young people on this call, is of particular interest when we hear a UN Youth Office. This would ideally be under an integration mandate, as hinted by the Secretary General in the report, integrating the activities of the Youth Envoy, leading high-level advocacy and coordination and accountability, overseeing points of contact in youth politics across member states. And given that the UN 75 consultative process had such a big youth voice, we would hope that it has a lot to say going forward. The trouble and the concern potentially here, though, is that when integrating activities, not just encouraging member states to take on youth voices and youth advocacy, but rather bringing it under the Secretary General's mandate, do we further silo the process? Does the Youth Office just act as a poster child for the work? And given that it hasn't really been invited to the Future Summit or mentioned in Future Summit, is it yet again just another project that works on its own without actually contributing to policies? The Transformation Education Summit is looking to focus at the Sustainable Development Goal number 4 and largely looks at COVID recovery, given the education setback and in general, the 2030 agenda setback due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we come on to this very interesting facet of the Special Envoy for Future Generations. This has both a strategic foresight role, which encompasses the Futures Lab, which hopes to look at impact assessment of the future, early warning systems, and essentially acts as a preventive mechanism. But it also looks at overseeing the repurposing of the Trusteeship Council, which is intended to be repurposed to act as a deliberative forum on behalf of succeeding generations. This relates then to both the Declaration on Future Generations and the next key pillar that this report hopes to cover: protecting and delivering global commons and public goods. So the Trusteeship Council would in turn also oversee this mechanism, along with a high-level advisory board. In other words, you can see in general through the 4 pillars that there's a strong strategic foresight focus, a strong data-based and modeling logos. Potentially, this is a continuation of the HLPF, but there's a lot to be said about whether this actually addresses root problems or if we're using very kind of surface level language in order to avoid addressing specific concerns such as power dynamics or incentive structures. In general, for this 3rd pillar, the logical flow is to establish a high-level advisory board to help identify global commons and goods, who would then report the findings that would be discussed at the Summit of the Future across 7 high-level tracks, which I'll cover shortly. And these in turn would hopefully, as the outcome of the summit, lead to commitments on the Declaration of Future Generations. Now, I'd like to quickly pick up on this biennial summit and as well as some of the reforms suggested for the WTO. A lot of this is focused on digitization, is focused on regrouping mechanisms, on integration mechanisms, and through these respects, capacity building of developing countries. It's almost elegantly skirting around issues of power, resource asymmetry, and incentives, which for anyone who's looked into free riding global commons or the tragedy of the commons know that these are the fundamental problems that need to be addressed to actually see a global public goods being used to their full capacity. Finally, we discuss, and probably what's of most interest to many people on this call, an upgraded UN. The Secretary General proposes a quintlet of change here, a set of cross-cutting agendas that underpin the initiatives of the report. The first is data analytics and communication. The second is innovation and digital transformation. The third is strategic foresight through initiatives like the Futures Lab or the Emergency Platform, behavioral science through mandate delivery, and performance and results orientation. There's also a suggestion to reform and rejuvenate both the UNSC Security Council, the General Assembly, and ECOSOC to make it more inclusive as a form of multilateralism, with dedicated civil society focal points in each of these organs in order to create a concrete mechanism through which civil society can engage directly with policymakers. Annual civil society caucuses are also encouraged in conjunction with GA High Level Week, so this will be in the form of an updated resolution. This is some recognition of the need for concrete engagement mechanisms, but it also reinforces what academia and research has been telling us for years, that civil society matters for sustainable peace, security, and prosperity. At the same time, the OCA, in attempting to be as common as possible, has forgotten to consider the diversity of regional priorities and challenges. In the C4UN regional consultations that we conducted in June, we identified that whilst there were some kind of common thematic priorities, such as the involvement of youth voices, items like data, strategic foresight, were overwhelmingly priorities of Europe and North America. Several other regions wanted focus on accountability of the United Nations, transparency, increased regulatory capacity, and considering power dynamics and what this means for the ability to access the United Nations. And yet we don't see this reflected throughout the common agenda, and specifically in the section of the UN 2.0. So moving forward into the kind of operational side and the logistics of our common agenda, we see that there is, the timeline is first to see a Transforming Education Summit, which will be followed by a Summit of the Future, and finally a World Social Summit. Within the Summit of the Future, we're looking at several high-level tracks that hopefully will lead to concrete outcomes, including the high-level advisory, including the high-level advisory board, considering sustainable development, climate action, a new agenda for peace, the Global Digital Compact, outer space dialogue, again, these coming under the Special Envoy for Future Generations, emergency response platform for complex crises, and a declaration on future generations. Now, all of these discussions will then lead to the 2025 World Social Summit. So that brings us to this discussion. And I think I'm about to hit my 15-minute mark, so I'll hand over to Becky. But we want to discuss what this means for us. How are we going to move forward within the discussion? How might the UN 75 Declaration and the OCA act as a vehicle for civil society advocacy proposals? I'll leave this page up for you, Becky, but over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Nudara. It was a very comprehensive presentation. Now we start our discussions. This seems to be a lot, it's a mouthful, but nevertheless, it's really important to look at this watershed development in our lifetime. This is not going to change most of the things that we are in right now, but this is certainly going to pave a path for us in order to look at something that we have to hope for. Because when we were trying to look at UN at 75 last year, in 2019, in preparation for UN 75 and looking at UN 2020, there was no COVID and there was no crisis as big as this that happened to all of us. So this coming out at this point in time, let us see as civil society leaders, as activists, as people who have been trying to engage the UN and our national governments, and even doing a lot of localization work, not only of the SDGs, but also trying to operational human rights agreements and all of those, what are our initial responses to this report? What do you think it will take to generate the political will? Is it political will that is necessary to accelerate these transformational changes and follow through on the commitments that have been made in the 2030 agenda, the Paris Agreement and the UN 75, as I said earlier? So let's go on with our discussion. How might the UN 75 declaration and the OCA act as a vehicle for civil society proposals? And then what do we need to see to come out of the UNGA next year to see the promise ahead? How might we engage with the OCA report in the long term? These are things that we need to see and try to find out, because as we said in our analysis, the changes that we need are actually very, very systemic. So may I invite you now for your thoughts on this. Maybe we can start with Mandeep. Mandeep, do you want to jump into the conversation and try to spur the responses?
Thanks, Becky, and Nidara, thank you very much for that excellent overview. It was really, really good, and I think you laid it out, very well what the report has to offer. I guess overall, from a civil society perspective that I'm speaking from on behalf of Civicus, I would say the Our Common Agenda report raises, several important issues, but it could have gone much further for us. I mean, as you mentioned, the indivisibility of human rights, the need to challenge the global infodemic, and for a new social contract are things that we should perhaps continue to push for. I think those commitments have been made at the UN level, and we should hold them to account for taking these forward. In fact, what is interesting about this report is that the report talks about networked, inclusive, and effective multilateralism, and which gives us an important, entry point into the UN system. So, for example, when they talk about networked multilateralism, they talk about cross pillar coordination. So I think here we should definitely need to emphasize that the work on sustainable development and peace and security and human rights cannot happen in silos, and there needs to be greater cross coordination and pollination, by and through civil society. There is a commitment on inclusive multilateralism, again, which is where the Secretary General says that there's a need to involve civil society, there's a need to involve intergovernmental institutions, there's a need to involve global South countries, which are described as developing countries within the report in decision making. So I think that's something that we really need to take forward. Greater diversity of states. We need to push for. Where I think we've been slightly disappointed is that although the report talks about all UN agencies to set up focal points for civil society in case they haven't already, this call by over 50 states and scores of civil society organizations for a high-level envoy for civil society is something that the Secretary General says has been heard, but will be has been parked for future consideration, even as an envoy for future generations has been recommended by the Secretary General. So I think we need to continue to push for that. Our entry point really is that on this high-level civil society envoy, the report erroneously says a single high-level entry point, sort of as if the envoy is going to be all things civil society and would create another bottleneck. We see that envoy position as an enabler, because the UN sprawling infrastructure engages civil society in uneven ways, in inconsistent ways. We need the civil society envoy actually to develop good practices, to share good practices, to have more consistent means of civil society participation and engagement in the work of the UN. So I think we need to continue to make a compelling case for that envoy position, and also again push on the few issues that the Secretary General has pushed for, has referenced at the end of the report about a civil society caucus parallel to the high-level segment of the UN General Assembly, and envoy can help make that happen. Again, there's a reference to changing the resolutions in relation to civil society participation at the General Assembly, the Security Council, and in the Economic and Social Council. So the envoy is somebody who can work with democratic states, supportive states, to push for that. I think our work has just begun. We need to continue to reference, continue to talk about better civil society participation. And I know Andreas Bammel and others in this meeting will also speak about the World Citizens Initiative and around a parliamentary assembly, which is really important for us, to go to speak about we the people's start the beginning of the opening words of the UN Charter to get there for it to be truly our common agenda. But let me stop there, Becky. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mandeep. Anybody want to jump into the conversation? Maybe Andreas can actually jump in now.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the floor, and Nodara for this excellent presentation, and Mandeep for your elaboration on the civil society dimension of the report. I can comment, as Mandeep has suggested, on this dimension that concerns people participation and participation of elected representatives. My initial take is that at the level of identifying the need of participation and increasing trust at the UN, the report is actually on track. The Secretary General clearly says in many parts of the report that people expect to be, to have a say in matters that affect them, and that this also expands to the UN. The issue with the report really is that it falls short of making proposals how that can be achieved, the need of participation beyond existing mechanisms and ad hoc consultations. The report really stresses again and again that the UN would build on the experience of the broad consultations carried out last year in connection with the UN 75 process. But certainly from our perspective, that is absolutely not enough. And the proposals of a UN Parliamentary Assembly and a UN World Citizens Initiative that have been endorsed by this People's Assembly 2 years ago, they are not mentioned in the report at all. I mean, not even as a footnote or anything. And that's despite the fact that they were featured quite prominently in the consultations in 2020, and also in another digital consultation that UN carried out this year, where both proposals were among those that received most votes. And I mean, the bottom line is really that the UN cherry-picked from the consultations. So I really would say we cannot be satisfied in this area with what the report delivers. And there's a lot to do. Of course, and that's my last sentence here as a comment, we need to recognize that, the political environment in which the Secretary General has to operate, which is very difficult. Some member states didn't even want to have any consultation at all, let alone stronger civil society, inclusion, and so on. We know that. So I guess it's really necessary that we get support at the level of member states that can back up UN-led processes moving forward.
Okay, Andreas, many thanks to you for sharing your insights. Now I'd like to call Zoel Nang from Malaysia. Malaysia actually organized this huge consultation at regional level. Zoel, can you share your insights on this and the processes that you took as young people from Malaysia?
Thank you, Madam Becky. Hello, everyone. I'm Zoel from Malaysia. I think that I'm glad that this year I have a lot of opportunities to join the regional and UN forum. And yet, I think that this opportunity I have to share with more Malaysian. So the action is very important. Throughout these few months, I've been joining a lot of forums and discussion. But I think we need some time to really sit down and with our local youth, with our local leaders to really plan out some action plan and to put all the thought, all the discussion and knowledge into action. So this is what I see, and I hope that we can have more collaboration and to move the to move together with the ground people.
Zoel, do you have anything to say about the youth envoy and the civil society envoy that's being proposed? That's very important, I think. As a result of your consultations, can you say something about that? Speaking to the youth, and all of these themes are actually themed on the future. It's like our common future, but it doesn't seem to for me crystallize so well. So maybe I need that kind of perspective from the youth to understand better.
Yeah, but it just involve them and to let them to explore. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Dan? Dan Perel?
Hi there. Yes. Hi there. It took a moment for my computer to realize that I indeed was turning on the camera. So thank you, Becky, and thank you, Nudara, and the previous speakers for the contributions. I have a couple of thoughts, if you're willing to hear them. My name is Dan Perel. I serve as a representative for the Baha'i International Community to the UN, also one of the co-chairs of the Coalition for the UN We Need. And we're instructed when providing constructive criticism to start with a compliment and end with a compliment. So that will be the format I'll take. So first, I'd like to just say that I do think the Secretary General offers a pretty good analysis of many of the shortcomings that humanity is facing today. I think it's worth reading some of the sort of subjective reading that he has of the world, and that's very helpful, with one glaring exception that I'll get to in a minute. I think Nudara raised this issue of root causes, which is super important. There's an assumption that the GDP is what it is, and we just need to change it. But there's a reason that GDP has come to be the main motivating factor for many, and I think we need to deepen on that and understand it. And more fundamentally, when we're talking about issues of root causes, there's really no mention of the limitations of a state-centric model, which disempower both the global efforts as well as the local efforts, because the state sort of takes over, it usurps everything. And so this structure is really disempowering. The Secretary General admittedly is an individual in a certain role. He's the product of a system that has a number of different priorities, and the way that one advances in there, you have to play by the rules. So within the confines of the rules, he does offer a number of interesting initiatives. I share the concern mentioned by Mandeep about the lack of mention of the civil society focal point. And in fact, that he said essentially that in every UN department, there should be a focal point. In the vast majority of them, there already is. So there's nothing new there, which is a little bit too bad. I wish that he had gone into a discussion about power. If it were purely economics, then countries would have committed the $50 billion it takes to vaccinate the world, because the returns are on the $1 trillion scale. And that would be an excellent investment. Also, the subsidizing of oil is more expensive than the subsidizing of renewable energy. So clearly it's not just economics, because if it were, then we would be making some different decisions. It's actually about power. It's about the retention of the system as it stands, the status quo, because the rule makers are the victors of the status quo. So they're the last ones to want to change. And I hope that in our language, we can also move beyond just its economics, because if it were purely economics, actually the results would be different. We do have a duty. I'm sorry, Becky, I have a couple more thoughts. We do have a dual duty as far as I see. One is to continue raising our voice from the outside about the shortcomings we see and what needs to be added. But also we have a duty to work within the system as best we can, because any small progressive change can be helpful to millions of people if it's done right. So while the system is limited, maybe thousands of people if it's done right. But even though the system is limited, we should still, I think, work both on the inside and also from the outside. And I think this space is a good example of that. And I just want to finish with the analogy that I kept thinking in my head as I was reading this report, which is an old joke from Stephen Wright. If anybody's familiar with him, if you're not, then you're about to be. He has this joke that I find very funny, which is a man takes his car to a mechanic and says, "Can you fix it? My brakes aren't working." And the mechanic comes back a week later and he says, "Listen, I couldn't fix your brakes, so I just made your horn louder." And this is what I think of the report. Yeah, it's useful to have a louder horn, but the car is still going to careen off the highway if it's going too fast. We can't. The brakes aren't working, and so I'm hopeful that we can indeed join forces to make that horn louder. But also we have to make the brakes work, which is perhaps a whole different system that many of us here and even Stefano Prato and others have been speaking about. So thank you very much, Becky, and thank you all for your patience with me.
Thank you very much, Dan. It was a great point that you have made, really. It's very important, really, to look at how we in the future can actually work together so that the disempowering structures are actually dismantled and not strengthened, right? So, Claudio, do you have something to say? You put something in the chat, but I'd like you to speak up and share your thoughts.
Thank you, Becky. Actually, what I put was just a reflection on what Dan said. That was, very powerful, because power relations is what drives a lot of decisions. Yeah. And contrary to economic myths, a lot of those decisions, they are not rational. And many of those are not even reasonable. So it's quite complicated. And I believe the 2030 agenda is just exposing its own paradox, because there are so many financial and commercial determinants that fight against the agenda itself that makes it very challenging. But about Our Common Agenda report, I liked very much the analogy that Dan had. But what really worries me, which was one of the themes that we discussed a little earlier, is the financial independence of the UN, or at this stage, the financial dependence of the UN, and the hostage situation that a lot of the multilateral institutions are living through in this commingling with the private sector. But here I would like to unpack private sector, because it's not really private sector. It's a very powerful oligopoly of very powerful monopolistic corporations. So it's not private sector like, your cousin who has a bakery or somebody that is just, making their living. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the capture of political and multilateral institutions by big corporations that hold monopolistic power. And the report should address a little bit of that. And I think that's what the horn and the brake is about. I think to fix the brake, the UN needs to acknowledge that, it has a very large dependence also on the states in such a way that is very asymmetric. So some states are more equal than others, if you know what I mean. And sometimes some elected officials can just tilt the balance in such a strange way and hold the whole institution, at bay. So I believe the UN needs to reflect a little bit on financial independence. And today I actually wore this shirt, which is the Robin Hood tax, because we do believe the Robin Hood tax and tax the ultra wealth could be one of the sources of such financial independence. Thank you, Becky.
Thank you very much. It reminds me of the days when we have been working on financial for development issues, and I shifted to poverty and inequality, and things are still the same. And the initial report, I remember, is akin to what is needed now. But with the huge pandemic over us, looming all of us, I think more actions have to be done, and more declarations have really to be done in terms of transformative actions. No? So I'd like to ask Nudara to come back to the floor and give us a sense of the regional consultations that were held, because I think those insights that we have gathered in the regional consultations for the UN at 75 are very important for this session. No? So please share that.
Thank you so much, Becky, and thank you also to everyone for your contributions. I think coming straight off of what Claudio said and that leading into the regional consultations report, I think there's almost an irony that comes out of the OCA report, in the sense to try to make the agenda common and inclusive and incorporate everyone, it forgets to identify that everyone are very different people and very different groups of people. So you do have the private sector, which acts very differently to the public sector, and the global north, which acts very differently to the global south, and the power dynamics and asymmetries between these groups. And I think in general, in an attempt to be very neutral, very encompassing and inclusive, the agenda fails to pick apart these little nuances that are in fact kind of fundamental to the multilateral architecture. And this comes into what we discussed in the findings of the regional consultations for C4UN. When we ran them in June, we ran them across 5 different regional hubs, and then including our youth consultations, we had 7 consultations as a whole, and I'll share the link to the report again in the chat. But what we realized is, while there were common thematic outcomes, youth involvement, the need for focal points, as Mandeep and Dan mentioned, concretely the need for focal points, right? There were these common themes, but equally we saw that across different dimensions, different regions saw different priorities. So for example, we saw that in the MENA region and the Africa region, there was a general need for increased resilience, increased law enforcement, increased accountability and transparency, whereas across the dimension of multilateral engagement, we saw the Asia Pacific and the North American and European regions want to have more kind of forums and summits and discussions as a whole of the multilateral system, as opposed to having this balance between international and international organizations and mandates. And I think it's a case of there was power being a main issue, and also the relative power and interdependence between regions. What we found was it wasn't just about what an issue mattered, how an issue mattered to an individual region. It was about how an issue mattered to a region relative to other regions. So for example, youth voices was something that the European North American region prioritized a lot, but maybe that was because in relation to some of the priorities of the MENA region when it came to conflict, youth voice didn't come out as loud as maybe it should have been. But I think it was a case of there's a need to pick apart the different stakeholders in general, and this is kind of what I'll conclude with. Our common agenda is common. It's meant to be for all of us, but I think the way this agenda relates to each of us is going to be slightly different. And what's going to see success is if we can identify how that agenda affects each of us differently and come out with concrete items that will help us with this progress. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Nudara, for your insights. I'd like to call last, if she's still here. Are you still there, Rosario? We'd like to hear from you. Hi, Rosario.
Hello, thank you, Becky. It's very nice to be with you and with everyone. And it's very exciting to see that we have this report and we have our voices on it. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the Regional Consultation for Youth. We engage and collaborate with CPI. and also with Mrs. Maria Fernanda Espinosa, who very gently joined us on the session and inspired young people from 10 different countries who participate on this process. So in July, we gather and we follow up the dynamic of the different discussions and some of the things that we find out on the consultation, because 80% of the time of the session was basically asking how young people wanted to see the UN from the youth side in the region. And it was that we want a decolonized UN that has a real intergenerational approach and also intercultural approach, because we understand that young people in our region is quite diverse. So it's very difficult to have a standardized approach to young people whenever we have our differences, whenever we have different cultures, whenever we have different social dynamics. So definitely we think that is something that is important, but we also consider that we explore also the vision of the UN, how we see it. And something that really interests me was that the participants perceive that the UN sometimes sees the things from a position of power. But we need to change the dynamics. We want to see a UN that sees the context, not necessarily from a position of power, but from a position of the people who's on the grassroots. So definitely that is something important, and also the fact that we ask for people to the UN and other relevant stakeholders in the future to deliver the tools and the right knowledge to empower the people and the different stakeholders on the basis, on the grassroots. So they are the ones who can lead the development processes of their communities. So kind of like going back to an approach of the UN, of a UN that provides the support so people can lead. So I guess those are the things that were very interesting, and definitely there was a very strong point regarding violence and inequality, and definitely the importance to have regional agreements and instruments such as the Escazú agreement. It was mentioned, and it is a very relevant agreement that we have in the region, and it was considered by the young people because it really ensures or helps us to ensure intergenerational justice in one region that is one of the most affected with climate change, and where many young people from indigenous communities and other rural communities and not necessarily privileged groups will be really impacted by the climate crisis. So this is some of the things that I can share with you, and definitely it was a great exercise, and we invite you to, or we hope that we can keep collaborating and invite you to also call us for different actions that we are happy to help. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Rosario. We have heard very diverse views, mostly critical of our common agenda report by the Secretary General. We nevertheless appreciate the coming out of the report, and we're looking forward to more of these discussions. As we said, we are in a very important moment in the history of our in the history of where we are now, no? In the history of humanity. This is the first time that this crisis has really birthed a lot of and exposed a lot of the systemic challenges all over the world, in our countries, between countries. All the inequalities have surfaced, all the lack of access to everything that is needed to really big difference in terms of solving the pandemic problem and getting back and reinventing the kind of world that we need. No? So this is the direction that we want to do. We want this results of the first initial conversation that we're having on the report. And as organizers of the C4UN, the Coalition for the UN We Need, we'd like to continue to have these conversations with you. We are going to have a global people's forum on October 19, and the results of this People's Assembly will be inputted into that. But we'd like to invite you to the subsequent processes that we're going to hold and be part of the October 19 conversation again, as we continue to challenge the UN and challenge all the institutions of power, because power should lie in us and power we should claim. Okay, so I close, and thank you very much to everyone for your contributions. Thank you very much. Good night, good afternoon, and have a good day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Becky, for stewarding us so late in your night.
It's
Thank
okay.
you. You did great. Thanks.
From the BTS. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.